But the problem is, in today's environment, real leadership might not get elected to anything, right? Real leadership would be saying, hey, let's calm down. Hey, let's take a breath. Let's have some conversations that produce some type of understanding where we might find a little bit of common ground to agree upon. But that right now is not firing up anybody to show up at the polls and vote for that.
Hey there. Welcome back to Pod and Deliver. Tonight we have a special guest, James Davenport. Sorry, James. James, how are you?
I'm doing great. How is sunny California?
Do you see what I'm wearing, James? I'm wearing a Hawaiian shirt just for you because
I am a little jealous.
It's very nice out here. Have you ever been to California?
I have. Let's see. When was the last time? I think 2019, 2020, sometime around there. I was out in San Diego for a conference and was there for 2 or 3 days.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. So yeah, we'll deal with this weather in October, 72 degrees. It's not too bad. And I'm not sure if you've met Ruben. Ruben, he's with us today again. And
how are you doing, Ruben?
Nice to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, I'm excited to be here.
Great.
Excellent.
Now, James, can you let our audience know your position and what you do in education and so forth?
Sure. I am the Associate Dean for Social Sciences at Rose State College. Rose State is a community college in Midwest City, Oklahoma, which is just a suburb of Oklahoma City. We're on the east side of Oklahoma City. And in addition to my administrative duties, I'm a member of the political science faculty here. So I teach a variety of political science classes, American government, state and local government, our intro to political science course. I've taught a course on the Constitution. So a variety of political science classes are what I specialize in.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. James, when I thought about having you on, there's a lot of different topics I was thinking about. And because I know you, like you shared, you've been teaching for quite a while at the college level. And you and I met back in, I think in Utah at the
that's right. It seems like
AP government grading. Remember that?
I remember.
So I'm so excited to have you, and just thinking about what can we talk about? I mean, I don't want to mess up this opportunity. And one of the things that came up, and it just happened, I think it was last week, James. You tell me if I'm wrong.
Right.
That Robert F. Kennedy Jr. just announced his candidacy for president, but not as a Democrat, but as an independent. And your thoughts on that, and what do you think about that?
Well, I think, initially he was going to run as a Democrat. He was going to try to run in a primary against Biden. And I think this shift to independent is two things. Number one, I think he's seeing that there's not any real support in the Democrat Party for a primary challenger to Biden, and certainly not one that isn't going to be running from Biden's left per se, right? I think and Kennedy is a really kind of odd kind of Democrat to begin with. A lot of his views overlap with some of what we might consider more right-wing kind of views, stuff about vaccines, and some other topics that he seems to not fit within the Democrat Party's infrastructure so much. And so I think this was a recognition that there's just not the support there. And I think it's also a recognition that if he wants to stay relevant, he's going to have to find another way of doing this. And so running as an independent gives him that ability to kind of stay in the race without running into all the obstacles of doing so within the Democratic primary process.
James, excuse me. This question that I have is perhaps related to Kennedy, but also perhaps other candidates or other ideas. You talked about in one of your lectures, you might have written this somewhere, the following stat. You wrote that 73% of Democrats think that the other side, Republicans, are dishonest.
Yes.
And then I believe around 68 or 69% of Republicans think that the other side is dishonest.
That is correct.
Now, to me, that is very alarming, very concerning, I should at least should say. And I would think a candidate. Oh boy, Jake! Now here we go get a more
It's
email.
okay, Ruben.
We don't need more emails because we got a lot to speak about positions we took. But
Go for it, buddy.
I would think when a candidate like this, who is Democrat until last week, pro-choice,
Mm-hmm.
I'm assuming economically more on supporting social programs,
Sure.
but might have some unique views from the Democratic Party, might be the perfect candidate that would bring both sides together. Am I right, or am I missing something?
Well, I think you're right in the idea that there is a kind of candidate that, based on certain positions, might be able to draw from both Republican and Democrat voters, right? I think that's true. The question isn't, is there a candidate that fits that? There are two questions we have to ask. A, is Robert Kennedy Jr. that candidate? And B, how many of those voters can he pull from those sides, right? So those are the two questions we have to ask. And I think the first question that I would answer is say, I don't think he is that candidate. I don't think there are enough Democrats that are willing to break ranks in a significant way that are going to follow him. Nor do I think there are enough Republicans that, given the plethora of candidates they have to choose from in their own party, are going to view him as a better alternative than what they might have currently. And I think that's true, even though, I mean, if you look at what 2024 is shaping up to be in the presidential race, we're about to get the one race nobody really wants, right? Nobody wants Trump, Biden, round two. And yet everything seems to be pointing that that's exactly what we're going to get. And I think part of that is kind of the strategic voting approach that most voters are going to go to 2024 with, which is, if I cast a vote for someone like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., I'm risking allowing the candidate I least want to win to sneak in, right? And so I don't know how he overcomes that.
What about, no, this is a separate topic, and I think you're right. I mean,
Yeah,
plenty of people will not vote for, plenty of Democrats will not vote for Kennedy, and I
Sure.
understand that. I guess I'm just asked, that last question was more on the theoretical.
Yeah.
I know
No,
the media, you know what I mean?
I absolutely think there is space there. The biggest challenge that anybody who wants to fill that space is going to have is, how do you manage the infrastructure? How do you create that the two major party candidates are going to have inherently, right? The Democrat Party and the Republican Party have this massive campaign infrastructure that they're going to bring to bear into this race. And anybody who's going to run outside of that, whether they run as an independent or whether they run as a third party candidate, building an infrastructure that can allow them to be competitive has proven over, the last half century or more to be extremely, extremely challenging. And that's the challenge. And I think the only way you get there is you've got to have somebody who has the personal resources to build that kind of infrastructure, right? So you're talking about somebody who basically one of these billionaires that wants to run. And even though, I mean, we had some of those folks run in the Democrat primary in 2020 before Biden emerged, right? You had, what was it, Michael Bloomberg, you had Andrew Yang, you had some, and even within the Democrat Party infrastructure, they weren't able to gain a foothold, and none of them thought it possible, at least by action, none of them thought it possible to recreate this kind of infrastructure outside of a major party. And so they just didn't run as independent. So I just think that's the biggest challenge, is how do you create, because you're going to need volunteer base, you're going to need people who can do all sorts of things on the ground, you're going to need to get out the vote effort, all of these things that these two major parties, Democrats and Republicans, have. and have them institutionalized, you've got to create on the fly.
It just seems like you mentioned, like only a billionaire probably could do, like Ross Perot, right, in the 90s. And even he was unsuccessful, although he came close of getting what did he get, like 19%, James? I can't remember.
Yeah, he got, it depends on which election you want to compare, right? So he runs and this is what I find really interesting. He runs as an independent in 1992, and he gets about 20% of the popular vote, right? If we added all the votes up of all the regular people, he'd get 20% of that. He didn't get a single electoral vote because he never got more votes in any given state than anybody else, right? And that's the key to getting electoral votes. But he did get a huge share of that popular vote. It just didn't translate into anything. He runs again in 1996, but he forms a third party, right? The Reform Party. Everybody forgets that that was a thing for a brief period of time. You have the Reform Party, and he runs again, and he actually does worse as a third party candidate than he did as an independent. So he gets about half the popular vote, and again, no electoral votes whatsoever. So even if you have massive resources to bring to bear, it's just really, really challenging, right? And part of that is what I call the third party trap, right? So if you're a third party candidate and you're going to run, well, you're in this environment where nobody votes for third-party candidates because they don't find them credible. And they don't find them credible because they don't win elections, right? Which is another way of saying because people won't vote for them. And so how do you, as a third party or an independent, break out of that kind of vicious loop? And nobody, again, over the past 50, I think it has been back in the 60s since the last time someone who ran who wasn't a Democrat or Republican even won some electoral votes.
Oh, wow.
And so you got to go back a ways before you even see a third party or an independent candidate who steals some electoral votes. And at the end of the day, that's really the only way. It's not the only way you can make a difference, right? So if you pull from one party and they lose their votes, that can have an impact on the electoral college. But if you really want to make things interesting, you've got to win some electoral votes.
So what you're essentially saying is RFK can't win.
I don't think he can
Yeah,
at all. Now, could he make things interesting? Maybe, right? So the question becomes, let's say you're in a state that's going to be in play. So let's take those Midwestern states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, these kind of states that could be up for grabs. Could he gain enough votes to pull from one of the two major candidates? And who would that most likely be, right? Would he be most likely to pull from Democrats? Would he be more likely to pull from Republicans? Or would he simply be more likely to pull votes from people who weren't going to vote for either of them to begin with, right? I don't know at this point in time what the answer to that is. And I'm going to say he's probably more likely to pull from that third group, right? People who weren't going to vote for Biden or Trump to begin with.
Yeah. But James, is it possible that he's also doing this because some of the issues that are important to him, like the vaccines, that he might think, you know what, I don't have a chance, but maybe the other two parties will talk about this if I jump into the arena?
I mean, we see that a lot where candidates will run and they know that they're not really in a position where they can win, but they hope to bring attention to a particular issue or set of issues that they feel like the other two parties are not devoting enough attention to. And so he could certainly run in that vein in hopes that he would force them to kind of address those issues. I don't get the feel that, if his issue is like vaccines, I don't get the feel that the two parties haven't been talking about those, enough. I just don't get it. You've got one party who wants to force everybody to take a vaccine. You got another party who aren't sure that they even believe the vaccines will work and that they might kill you. And so they've been having some back and forth on these already. And I don't know what he brings to the table on that particular issue. Now, there may be some others, and I'll be honest, I haven't followed his campaign super closely. Maybe he's got some other issues that he wants to highlight as well, but that seems to be the one that kind of stands out. That's the one that when people start talking about Kennedy, the vaccine issue is the one that they bring up almost always the first, right?
There are, yes, it is. And not to belabor the point of Kennedy, he just seems to be the guy who could be the spoiler, the guy who has, seems like he's been embraced. Somebody had mentioned, I read, this is what I was going to bring up earlier, that he would actually be more problematic, perhaps for the Republican nominee than the Democratic nominee, even though he's been a longtime Democrat. So that there's something else.
Yeah, I think, there, especially since the vaccine issue is probably one where he would pull more who might be inclined to vote for a Republican, depending on who the Republican nominee would be. That there might be a case to where, again, at the margins in those really tight states, that he could pull some votes away from that candidate. And as we saw in 2020 and really in 2016, in some of these races, you're only talking about a few thousand votes separating the two main candidates. And so you got a third party candidate in that still some of the votes you were counting on, all of a sudden you're in a world of hurt. And so the potential is there for sure for him to be a spoiler, if you will. I just am not convinced yet he's at the point where that's what's going to happen, right? Not saying that it can't, not saying that it won't, just that I haven't seen it emerge as of yet.
Yeah, because you mentioned that. I'm sorry, you mentioned that it's so that not to be Democrats are really excited about Biden, not to many Republicans are really excited about early. I mean, I know there's a lot who are excited about Trump, but there's many who aren't. And so that being said, you say, wow, you kind of want to find somebody who's going to be pleasing. And I have talked to people from both sides, and they're like, yeah, we like Kennedy, but I totally hear your arguments, and I think they make sense. But I mean, how about the young people at your school? I mean, do they seem excited about this election, or do they seem like, because usually young people don't go vote, correct?
They're kind of like young people everywhere. I don't think they're paying a whole lot of attention right now, except to when I bring it up to them. Oklahoma is a more conservative state than, say, like California or New York or someplace. And so our student body is probably going to reflect that a little bit more. But even in Oklahoma, younger voters tend to be a little bit more left than older voters. And so you're going to have a little bit more of a lean that way. But I don't think they've locked in yet to what's going on. And I certainly don't think, if they were inclined to vote for a Republican, I don't get the feel that there's anybody out there that has emerged as the alternative to Trump, right? And that's reflected in the polls. When you look at all these polls, and Trump is up by 4, and I think that's what has thrown a lot of us political observers is, how can a guy who keeps getting indicted, keeps walking, getting thrown into court, how can his poll numbers continue to go up during that process? And so it's just, and I had a student, I was visiting with some students yesterday, and they were like, well, don't you think he should participate in the debates? And it's like, why would he? He obviously doesn't need to.
Sure.
He's doing just fine without stepping foot on a debate stage and giving any of those folks the opportunity to go after him, personally. So
do you feel like the reason why Trump has scored higher in polling among Republicans is because of this? You had mentioned a decline in social trust, social capital, social trust, and maybe a suspicion of those institutions like the FBI and things. It's like, well, we're going to like you more if you're indicted because we don't even respect those institutions anymore because of maybe past actions and things like that. What would you say? Is that the reason, or there's something else?
No, I think there's a couple of things going on. I certainly think on the Republican side, there has been this steady erosion of faith, right? What you hear them talking about is a two-tiered judicial system, right? I hear that from Republicans on the side. There's one set of rules for Democrats, and there's another set of rules for Republicans, and that's why they're going after Trump. And Trump is just kind of the visual that they can point to and say, see, but you're not indicting Hillary and you're not indicting Biden, and what they, from stepping back as someone who's not involved in those partisan arguments to the extent that many of them are, they seem to forget, to get someone into court, you've got to have enough evidence to bring that case. And whether or not you believe Hillary did something illegal, or you believe Biden has done something illegal, if you can't stack up enough evidence to prove to a court that this is worth its time to have a trial over, you're not going to go anywhere. And that has been the challenge that they've run into. Now, their response is, oh, the evidence there, those judges just don't want to see it, right? And so not only now are you seeing this erosion of trust in law enforcement, the FBI and such, you're seeing erosion of trust in the judicial system and judges are becoming more attacked from a partisan manner than you have seen in the past as well. And yeah, so the social trust that we have placed in many of these institutions has been eroded significantly over the last, between 5 and 10 years, as they have been drug into these partisan conflicts.
James, don't you? Go ahead.
I'll just say this is more of a general teaching question, but correct me if I'm wrong, James, that you mentioned that you teach in a you try to teach in a nonpartisan way.
Yeah, I try to, it's my goal that my students can never quite pin down where I am on the political spectrum, right? And so now, if you listen, or if you're like really observant and you really listen closely, you probably can pick up, but you've got to be doing that. And most students they're not thinking in that way. And so at the end of the year, I always do an activity of the last day of class. I call it Ask the Professor. And I let students ask me anything they want to ask me. And usually one of the questions will be, what party are you a member of? Or, that kind of thing. And I'll say, well, what do you think? And if I have about half the class saying I'm a Republican and half the class saying I'm a Democrat, I'm like, I've done my job well. Right. And so, and that can be hard. None of us come to this completely unbiased with no perspective on certain things whatsoever. Right. And that's going to filter through in how you teach. It's going to filter through in the kind of subjects you emphasize, the kind of framework you build around those subjects. So it's not entirely possible to say, oh, I'm going to teach totally objectively. But I try to, as much as I can, let them explore these ideas from their own perspective and just provide some overall context, some overall institutional knowledge about how the structure works, these kinds of things.
Oh man, I wish other instructors felt the same way you did and looked at it that way, because Ruben and I were just mentioning it, I think in a previous episode regarding, I came on and said, the education, at least in California, it's pretty liberal. And then he corrected me. He said, hey, progressive maybe is a better word. I go, yeah, progressive. And because a lot of my, a lot of people in education out here in the West have no problem saying where they're from, and even sometimes get really far to the left. And you go, wow, I mean, is that really fair to the kids? But if we had more people doing what you do, which is saying, hey, you know what, let the kids figure it out. Let them, you want them to be critical thinkers, right? You want them to be able to look at arguments and come to conclusions themselves. And they may not have the same conclusions as you, but that's okay, as long as they thought it out, right?
And I think, from my perspective, and I've got a lot of colleagues and we talk about this on a regular basis, and what I don't want to be in a position of is, because I let a student know my particular political leanings, they just shut down anything else that I discuss for the rest, right? Oh, you don't like Trump, so I'm not going to listen to anything you say. Or, oh, you don't like Obama, so I'm not going to listen to anything you say. Then my job of education is almost impossible to do, right? And so by backing away somewhat and trying to give kind of here are the arguments that are out there. Here are the arguments that you're going to see, giving them some basic information and say, okay, now you've got to decide which of these arguments makes more sense to you, and what evidence you're going to use to make that judgment on. I think they're better served in that process than me just trying to say, no, this is what's right and this is what's wrong, and you need to listen to me. I do a lot of public forum stuff. You saw, as you mentioned, some of my public lectures. So if they wanted to, I do some writing. So I've written for some commentaries for different publications. If they want to know what I think, it's not hard to go and find. But that's my belief, is the classroom isn't where I proselytize, right? The classroom isn't where I try to convert people to my perceptions. It's where I give them basic knowledge and some tools in how to evaluate things, and then let them come to their own conclusions.
This might be a provocative question, but it's just something I think about lately. I've never seen two sides. I mean, this is kind of like the theme, I guess, because I kind of opened, my first question was about this idea of the two sides pitted against each other.
Mm-hmm.
We just did a video on the gender pronouns thing, being two sides just totally believing in their own position as fine. It's fine to have a position, but thinking the other side is ruining society.
Right.
And so I think of this Trump versus Biden, because you're basically saying this is what it's going to be in the next election. Because I know there are some people who believe Newsom was going to jump in, or no, DeSantis is over going to take. I don't think DeSantis is going to beat Trump, but some people think that, or Vivek will do it. But assuming it's Trump Biden, boy, talk about two opposing viewpoints. Do you? I just imagine the election results in 2024, the other side, whoever loses, is going to be so disappointed. Do you foresee any type of violence on the streets as what we saw in 2020? Now, I could see, because I know there were people who talked about violence in the last election, but do you see something like that happening?
I hope not. It's not hard to think of a scenario in which something might play out that way, right? Where, again, you have maybe a handful of states where the difference is a mere few thousand votes. People begin questioning, how were those votes counted? Did and you begin to hear accusations that election was stolen, and you hear people say, we can't let them steal this election. Well, how do you prevent that from occurring, right? You take action, and inevitably that action is going to lead to some kind of violence. I just don't see how people are going to have to back away from the rhetoric first if they want to diffuse the potential for violence. And unfortunately, I don't know what you guys are feeling, but I don't see anybody willing to back off their rhetoric right now. And whether you're talking about, in Oklahoma, we've been dealing with the transgender issue as well. And the big thing here in our state has been whether or not parents should be able to get their children transgender surgeries or care if they feel like their child is a transgender child. And yeah, neither side wants to talk about this in a way that develops real understanding of the issue. They simply want to talk about it in a way to encourage outrage on their side, to get their people motivated, or to get confusion on the other side so people aren't really sure what they're talking about. But neither side is really facilitating any kind of conversation that is helpful.
It sounds like we need real leadership, right?
we desperately do. But the problem is, in today's environment, real leadership might not get elected to anything, right? Real leadership would be saying, hey, let's calm down. Hey, let's take a breath. Let's have some conversations that produce some type of understanding where we might find a little bit of common ground to agree upon. But that right now is not firing up anybody to show up at the polls and vote for that. Right. And it goes to more. So we talked about the political parties, and that YouGov survey, Ruben, that you mentioned that I cited in a couple of my lectures. It's not just that they or the Pew Research, it's not just that they find them dishonest, they find them immoral, they find them dishonest, and they find them closed-minded. Right. And so if you think of the people who are advocating for things you don't like in those terms, there's no surrender, there's no negotiation, there's no compromise with those folks. You just beat them, right? And that is the mentality that we have. And what it has produced is, and YouGov, this is the survey I was going to mention, YouGov and Common Ground did this survey, and they produced what they call the perception gap, where both people from both parties imagine that the people from other parties have these way more extreme views than they actually do, right? And so now I don't understand you. I don't like you. I don't trust you. And I think you're really extreme. Where are we going to find common ground in that environment? Where are we going to find places to compromise in that environment? And all of our institutions, right, from interest groups to the media to social media, political parties, even religious groups now, they're all geared to foster that kind of distrust and animosity. They're not geared to calm us down and say, hey, let's take a breath. Let's get some sanity back into the conversation. They are geared to increase the division and contentiousness.
James, you just mentioned the media, and I have a friend who posts he's a very good friend of mine, so I felt very free to tell him this. He posts very divisive comments on Facebook. I've had other friends unfriend him, and I finally told him, hey man, he was very angry when I said this, but he's my friend and I can tell him whatever I want. I said, hey man, you got to stop watching the news. And so that's my antidote for his anger and unfriending people, unfriending him. And we were all one at one point. And I tell him, hey, just do it. I know I'm an English teacher, so I have a bias what is how to approach the news. I just tell him, read Charles Dickens, read Dostoevsky. I don't mean to sound like a nerd, but these ideas have stood the test of time.
Right.
And that is where you should get your news. Sorry, I'm off my soapbox.
No. Again, I'm going to go back to that YouGov survey. One of the interesting things they found was, and this kind of goes against what people in my field kind of teach, right? We're telling people you need to stay informed, you need to be politically engaged, right? You need to know more about what's going on. And this YouGov survey said, well, the more politically active you are, the more likely you are to be misunderstanding the people you're opposing, to not know where they're at, right? The more news you watch, the more likely you are to misunderstand the people you're opposing and not know where they're at, right? And so it becomes this question of, well, how do you balance these things? Because democracy is built on an active and engaged citizenry. We don't want people just sitting on their hands. But how do we inspire them to get active and engaged without getting them into this partisan, polarizing environment to where they can't see anything but evil people on the other side that they're trying to defeat? And if I had the answer to that, I'd be making a lot more money than I am today, for sure. But that seems to be the environment we're in, which is everything is geared for us to increasingly be hostile to anyone who disagrees with us on anything. And to shut them down, to not want to listen to them, to not want to explore ideas with them, in some cases to not even tolerate them, right? And that's a horrible place for us to be as a society, and it does not bode well. And what I'm concerned about is, when we talk about political scientists often talk about democracy needing active, engaged citizens, but for democracy to truly work, there has to be a whole lot working in the background and in areas that we call civil society. So things like Rotary clubs and Lions clubs and chambers of commerce and even religious organizations and things where people put aside their political differences and they come together. They want to improve their community some way, or they want to address a specific problem. Maybe it's poverty or homelessness or whatever. And they're like, you know what? I don't care if you're Republican, Democrat, or whatever. If you care about this issue and I care about this issue, we can work together on it, right? That has to be happening. That's that social trust and cooperation that I talk about. Democracy can't live without that. And what we're seeing today is increasingly our political divisions are preventing us from engaging in these other areas of society and cooperating. And increasingly, I mean, we've got data now that says, Republicans only eat at these restaurants and Democrats eat at these restaurants. There was a really, really interesting study talking about how even in the same neighborhood, Republicans and Democrats will segregate themselves from one another and not interact with one another. And we know that, in general, in geography, it's that way, right? So urban centers, far more Democratic, rural centers, far more Republican. And so we're letting these political divisions guide every other facet of our lives, and that's not healthy.
I do want to point out real briefly, James, that there are two issues right away. because you were mentioning how there's all these issues that divide us. Well, there are issues that connect us too. That you're hinting, that you had mentioned that we could come together on things. Two I could think of right away are peace over war. There's a lot of Democrats and conservatives that believe in this, and the other one is energy, finding more useful means of energy.
Sure.
Those are two right away issues that the two sides can agree on, and then they could build from there. I just want to throw that out.
I think if you do survey data, you find that the American public on issues is way closer together than what it feels like we are, right? They're much more aligned, whether you're talking about gun control or healthcare or the environment, these kind of things. You don't see that kind of division that you see amongst our leaders, right? Amongst the folks in Congress or in the state legislature or wherever, where there's this constant fighting. And so the question is, how do we get these folks who are in the public to elect people who are in the legislature that are more like them, more willing to say, hey, there is some areas that we can agree to. And that's just, it's extremely difficult. I mean, you've got the whole power of incumbency is a real thing. It's hard to overcome that. You've got entrenched interests in the way things are. And so it's just very, very challenging. Not that we haven't, I mean, look, we've had a lot of problems. And this is my biggest concern, right? Is that when I look at trends and when I look at where we are and things that we are working on today, let's say I was to live another 50 years, which that would be awesome because that would put me over 100, right? But if I was to live another 50 years, I can envision a world where we've mostly conquered cancer. We have resolved environmental issues, whether you're talking about climate change or anything. We've pretty much resolved those. We figured out how to better allocate resources that all of us can benefit from, right? We've solved poverty. In 50 years, all of that is within our grasp. And my biggest concern is just as about we're on the cusp of solving these major problems, we're going to throw it all away because we can't get along with each other, right? We can't see past R&D, right? And so we're going to let those divisions prevent us from entering in, I'm a big Adam Smith fan. I love reading. I teach on the Wealth of Nations in my political philosophy class. And he used this term called universal opulence. And he said, we're going to enter into this age where there's just this universal opulence. And I'm like, that is coming in the next 50 years if we don't ruin it. And my concern is we're perilously close to ruining it, by letting these different influences continue to tear us apart.
Wow. You know what, James? I think the hope is that things will get better than worse, right? I think that's what we all three of us, and even of course others. But you know what, James, I just want to thank you for being with us this fine day. And when we're talking, I'm like, oh, I want to talk about term limits with Congress. Oh, I want to talk about what he thinks about McCarthy getting kicked out. So I hope someday soon that you'll be willing to come back on us so we get on this channel to talk to us about these issues, because there's so much going on in our country, and I'd love to pick your brain. Hope that's okay.
Absolutely. You're right. There's a whole bunch of stuff out there, and we can't solve the world's problems in a day or whatnot. But if we can kind of find some things and say, hey, you know what, if we went this way, or if we did this way, maybe that can be shared with larger groups, and people can start figuring some of that out too.
Well, thank you again. And Ruben, did you have something to say before we go, Rube?
Yes, thank you for providing a fruitful discussion, and I have hope. I think you do too, and we can only hope for the best.
That's right. We can only hope, and if we have the hope, we can do the work to make it happen. Thanks, Jacob. Thanks, Ruben. It's been great visiting with you.
Great. Well, with that, audience, thank you for being with us today, and we will see you soon on Pod and Deliver. Bye-bye.